San Diego was the first of 21 missions that would be founded, the last being San Francisco Solano in Sonoma in 1823. These Spanish colonial institutions were always meant to be temporary. They were frontier institutions run by Franciscan missionaries. The friars' chief goal was to evangelize and convert indigenous people to Catholicism, a form of Christianity. But the friars understood that the Spanish colonial government saw missions as key to incorporating indigenous people into colonial society. They would do this through teaching skills and cultural norms. The California experience came at the tail end of 300 years of Spanish colonial rule in the Americas, in which the Franciscan missionaries played an important role since the early 1500s. They were the first to arrive in the Americas, 12, significant number. Since the missions were meant to be temporary, it was understood that someday the missions would cease to be needed and would close. In the early 19th century, there is already a strong sentiment in New Spain or Mexico to secularize the missions. And this sentiment grew after Mexican independence in 1821. And so you get the decrees of secularization issued in 1833 and 34. The mission period in California was therefore very brief, but highly impactful. It is in the mission period that agriculture and ranching are established, which would become the basis of California's economy even today. But it is also a period in which diseases brought by colonists had devastating impact on the indigenous populations and their societies. This included a high death rate. It hit especially hard among infants or children and the elderly. And these deaths, along with efforts to acculturate indigenous people into colonial society, caused great disruption and loss of generational cultural knowledge within indigenous communities. In addition, Western agricultural practices introduced plants and animals which disrupted traditional food practices and changed ecosystems. In this slide, you see an image of a map in the collection of SB Mall. It is a survey map of California that was undertaken in 1848 and overseen by John C. Fremont, probably a familiar name. And it was used in the 1849 Constitutional Convention for California, so we could become a state in 1850. So if you ever have the chance to take a tour of the archive library, and this is out for you to see, you'll see pencil marks where they delineated the counties of what was to be the new state of California. And that had to be determined before we could be a state. And when we're talking about the change in ecosystems, there are a lot of plants that are introduced that are invasive and change the landscape. land practices. The Chumash use fire to manage land, and of course, for the Europeans, that is like, we're not going to set things on fire, so there's a clash there. But animals such as pigs, were highly disruptive. They would tear up land and gardens and all sorts of things, or natural ecosystems. So this is the world that, by the time Edwin Deakin comes west, I should say, let me finish up a little bit more of the history here before we move on, is that after secularization, eventually all of the Alta California missions closed except for Mission Santa Barbara. So the missions fell into disuse, and the buildings themselves were no longer needed. They were not seen as valuable except for the building materials like roof tiles and timbers that could be scavenged for other projects. The main value were the lands and the agricultural enterprises the missions had overseen. So the missions themselves fell into disrepair very quickly due to neglect, natural disasters, earthquakes, fire, all sorts of things that could happen to these buildings. And of course, once they're not maintained, their erosion is very quick. And so another thing that's important is under the Spanish colonial system, the understanding was as temporary institutions, the missions and the colonial government was only holding the land in California in trust, and that the land would be returned to indigenous people when the missions were no longer needed. That, of course, did not happen with Mexican independence. The policies changed. And so it's after the colonial period, actually, that you start to get the indigenous people losing their land legally or within the system of the government. By the time Edwin Deakin arrived in the West, California had become a state within the United States, and missions and the roles they played in California history were quickly fading from the landscape and from the consciousness of most Californians. So Edwin Deakin was born in Sheffield, England in 1838. And at an early age, he worked as an apprentice, painting landscapes and floral designs on furniture. He and his parents immigrated to Chicago in 1856, where his parents opened a hardware store. Edwin Deakin hoped for a career in art, but found limited opportunities. In 1865, he married, and a year later, the couple welcomed their first child, a son. He worked for a while hand painting photos, or hand coloring photos, but he stopped in 1867 to focus on painting. He was self-taught, or as one author put it, he was taught by nature. His first publicly displayed painting was of an old English tavern. By the end of the decade, he became a member of the Chicago Academy of Design. Deakin first visited San Francisco in 1870 and participated in some exhibitions. It's here that he would eventually establish his career as a painter. Initially, reviews of his work were not positive. They're rather harsh, and he didn't take the reviews well. In fact, he became quite emotional, and some described him as becoming very angry indeed. And so being discouraged by this, it was difficult for him. He did return to Chicago in 1871, but in October of that year was the Great Chicago Fire, which destroyed the city, including the business his parents owned. So he and his wife and children returned to San Francisco, where he first worked and lived in San Francisco itself, the city, on Clay Street. But in time, he would purchase land in Berkeley, and that's where he would build his home and his studio. Now, the fortunate thing is when the great San Francisco earthquake hits, he is actually spared because his studio is in Berkeley, where many of his colleagues lost much of their art. So landscapes were his focus initially, and these landscapes included the sites and the landscapes of Illinois, but also the landscapes and the sites he saw when he traveled between Illinois and California. And this was the focus until about, well, first he exhibited paintings in 1872 in San Francisco as a member of the San Francisco Art Association. And then he started to refine his focus or define his focus differently. He started to focus particularly on California landscapes. Lake Tahoe especially, and Yosemite especially. I think these are absolutely gorgeous. And these are pure landscapes. But it's also in this time that he starts to really notice the missions and starts to paint missions, but it's going to take a little while for that to really become the focus of his paintings. Like many of his colleagues in the Bay Area and throughout California, the focus was on landscapes at this time. He did do a painting of Mission Dolores in 1870, but it wasn't really until the 1880s that he started to make the missions and their architecture the subjects of what would become his signature. In the Bay Area, he joined an increasingly robust art scene in the late 19th century, and California was being incorporated into the larger cultural, social, and political context of westward expansion, and in addition, the celebration of the centennial 1876. And all this contributed to the reimagining of the Spanish missions as part of the founding of the United States and the reimagining of the interpretation of early mission period as an ideal time. This view was often represented in art that was focused on the majestic landscapes of California. As the art scene and market became saturated with these majestic landscapes, Deakin switched his focus. He shifted his focus. He started to paint what they call intimate landscapes. So you can see the scene at Strawberry Creek in Berkeley is much more personal. And he also started to paint still lifes. If you look at the Crocker Museum collection, you see a lot of this era of work. It's beautiful work. And so there is this huge shift, but there are other things going on in California in the late 19th century which starts to produce a kind of synergy between Deakin and other artists and writers and other figures in the late 19th century in California. It's also in the late 19th century that others started focusing on the mission era, including Helen Hunt Jackson, who in 1884 published the novel Ramona. Anybody ever gone to see the production of Ramona in Southern California? I think it's still performed. Is it still performed? Yeah. And it's about star-crossed lovers struggling with the forces, political forces, cultural forces in California after the Mexican-American War. But within that struggle, the mission era is presented in a romanticized view, this romanticized view of life during the mission period, reflecting Helen Hunt Jackson's own perspective of that era. And so you start to see, again, this rediscovery of a period that had kind of drifted out of the consciousness of Californians, but it's coming back reimagined in a very romantic, idealized way, and also being incorporated into the United States. And it's kind of interesting to think of the friars as founding fathers of the United States, which is kind of how they get the founding friars, I should say, of being founding fathers, like Junípero Serra being incorporated as one of the founders, is very interesting reimagining. Other figures of that time, such as Henry Chapman Ford, his etchings and paintings also focused on California and the missions themselves. And the painting that we have here is actually a watercolor in the SB Mall collection. The painting of San Luis Rey de Francia from 1888. The archive has a couple of his watercolors. And so you also have figures such as Charles Lummis popularizing the mission past as well, again in this romantic, uncomplicated manner. And this all contributed to the revival of mission-style architecture and efforts to conserve and preserve the California missions in the late 19th and early 20th century. So you have this mission revival style of architecture and the arts and crafts movement all coming together in the late 19th and into the early 20th century that produced this energy and this aesthetic and style, but it's all part of this romanticized notion of what the mission past was. Meanwhile, as you look around, you can see that the buildings themselves are falling apart, right? So the fact that these artists and writers are drawing attention back to that era, it will become really important, really significant. So it's Henry Chapman Ford who actually completes and exhibits the first complete series of paintings of missions from Alta California. Interestingly, Edwin Deakin would claim he came up with the idea first. Especially after Henry Chapman Ford died, he would say this more. And so, why not? And he would say, I thought of it first, but I kind of stepped aside because I knew he was working on it too, so I just let him do his thing, And so that was his claim. But it would be a while until Deakin would complete his first series, and it was in oil in 1899. But other artists soon followed, the missions becoming a very popular subject. Deakin would publish a book. He would publish a book with black and white reproductions of his first series of oil paintings of the California missions in 1899-1900. And all these works by Deakin and other artists helped create a California identity that was steeped in nostalgia and ignored the complex and often fraught aspects of Mission-era California. But these works also called attention to artifacts from a significant period of early California history and was showing people that it was in danger of disappearing. Deakin exhibited the first mission series in oil at the San Francisco Palace Hotel. In response, the Outlook credited him with calling attention to the, quote, urgency of preserving the landmarks. Deakin was looking for a home for this series. He was looking to sell the entire series. He wanted to keep it all together, but all he would get were offers for individual paintings within the series. And he was determined to keep it all together, so he would refuse to sell any of the individual paintings. And the perception is that he seemed to be reluctant to sell any of his paintings. He did continue to paint and exhibit his work up to his death in 1923. And upon his death, the paintings in his estate were placed in storage. In the late 19th century, Deakin would end up painting 3 complete series of all 21 Alta California missions. 2 would be in oil, 1 in watercolor. The first series in oil was lent to and eventually purchased by the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. The second series of oils is in the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library, or actually here tonight. And the watercolors were purchased by the Santa Barbara Historical Museum a few years ago. Interestingly, there was actually a bill in the state legislature to fund the purchase of the first series of oil paintings, but it didn't pass. So it wouldn't be until much later that the Natural History Museum bought them. So how did that second series of oils end up in Espy Mall? They were donated to the friars at Mission Santa Barbara by Elaine and Howard Willoughby. Paul Mills, the former curator of the Oakland Art Museum, credited Howard Willoughby, among others, with the revived interest in the paintings of Edwin Deakin. In 1951, after seeing the first set of oils at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles, Howard Willoughby researched Edwin Deakin, and this led him to Deakin's nephew, Robert Deakin. Robert Deakin was executor of his uncle's estate and had many of his uncle's paintings in storage where they had been placed upon Edwin Deakin's death. And they remained there until Mr. and Mrs. Willoughby purchased them in 1955. I don't think Phyla is here tonight, but Phyla Rogers, the Willoughby's daughter, lives here in town. And she often comes, or she used to often come to visit the paintings, and she was here for opening night with her daughter. And she would tell me stories about how many of Deakin's paintings and other works would be hanging in their family home. Imagine. Yeah. So they purchased them in 1955. And then subsequently, this series of oil paintings, well, I should say, not only did they find their way into the Willoughby home, but they also, through the Willoughbys, found their way into many museums, thankfully, including Espy Mall. In December of 1955, the Willoughbys donated 11 of the 21 oil paintings to the friars. And the remaining 10 would be donated a year later in December of 1956. The series would eventually be incorporated into the collections of Espy Mall, which didn't incorporate as an archive until 1967. But the paintings had an interesting journey after that Daisha alluded to. At this period in time, the Santa Barbara Historical Society was housed at Old Mission Santa Barbara. And so the paintings were actually put on display in the rooms occupied by the Historical Society as a loan. And this way the public could see them. When the society moved here and the museum was built here on De La Guerra, the Historical Society requested the loan of the paintings and that they move with them here. And this is where they were until 2005, when the Archive Library requested their return. So see a long connection in many ways between the Historical Museum and the Mission and the Archive Library. In 2014, the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library embarked on a campaign to conserve the paintings. So I'm gonna anyway, no, I'm not gonna, because I'd have to go all the way back. I should have reinserted a slide from the beginning, but early on in this presentation, I had a slide of the conference room with the paintings on the wall. And I don't know if you noticed there were index cards next to some of them, and some of them had your orange dots on them. It wasn't because we were selling them. It did mark that they had sponsors. So we adopted them out to sponsors to get them cleaned up. And really, the paintings themselves needed to be cleaned, needed new varnish. It was really the frames, these are the original frames, that needed to repair, extensive repair. So in 2014, we embarked on this fundraising campaign, and it's through generous donations by people like Mark and Pauline Sylvain and John Guarini, our longtime board member and current board president, that we could, and many, many folks who, like families, would join together, family members, to come up with the money to sponsor a painting. And it was just the community really came out, which showed us the affection Santa Barbarans have for these artworks. And so the conservation was completed in 2016. It was undertaken by Fine Arts Conservation Labs, and thank them very much for the work they did. But what we were seeing as they were being returned was extraordinary. They were amazing before, but when they came back clean with fresh varnish on them, and we eventually got great lighting on them, they just glowed and became almost three-dimensional. And so it was just exciting to see them come in. And even the art conservator, one of them would say, I was cleaning this area and I said to myself, oh my gosh, those are sheep. You know, it's like things that come to the foreground when you actually clean a painting, right? So thankfully, we have so many good people to help us get these conserved, and look how beautiful they are. So what had Edwin Deakin intended when he painted these 3 complete series of paintings of Alta California missions? And did he achieve what he intended? Just sharing with you these in-progress photos. You can see Mission Soledad. Partially, you know, tiny sliver clean, just so you start to see what the impact is of just cleaning. But also you see the back of the canvas. And the interesting thing that Edwin Deakin put on many of his paintings on the back was a coat of arms he designed for himself. And so you see it on your left. So what did he intend, and did he achieve it? As historical documents, these paintings illustrate the changes in priorities in California throughout the 19th century. The missions had once been central to the founding of Spanish colonial society and economy in California, and many missions reached their peak in the 1820s. But would become run-down artifacts of a bygone era by the mid-19th century, only to see renewed interest, but imbued with nostalgia and reframed as part of the story of the founding of the United States in the late 19th century. In the early 20th century, this reframing was reinforced by the growth of the California tourism industry. So those of us here in California who can still see them, the Camino Real bells, that's part of that whole movement to link tourism and our mission past. It's the Automobile Club, in case you were wondering who get that going. What you see in the paintings are the missions 70 years after Mexican independence, a little over 60 years after the decrees of secularization, officially ending the missions, and 50 years after California became part of the United States. In the paintings, most of the missions are in disrepair due to neglect and natural disasters. The exception is Mission Santa Barbara, we're in the back. And this was because of the Den brothers who came to own and lease the lands of Mission Santa Barbara and allowed the friars to stay. And so therefore, Mission Santa Barbara is the place of the longest continuous presence of Franciscans in the United States. Not the oldest, but the longest. In addition, the Mission Church depicted it was built in 1820, with the second bell tower added in 1833 to replace the previous church, which was destroyed in 1812 earthquake. So it's fairly new, relatively speaking. So why did these all fall into disrepair? Because for the Mexican government after independence, it is struggling financially, and the land is extremely valuable. And those leases or sales of former mission lands was a way to help themselves economically, but also to reward allies. And thankfully for Mission Santa Barbara, those who ended up, the Den brothers who ended up with the land, allowed the friars to stay. In presenting these views of the mission buildings and their surroundings, Edwin Deakin helped bring to the fore their precarious state and would help spark a renewed interest that led to efforts to conserve them, in some cases rebuild them. These paintings also reflect the affection Deakin had for his adopted home and its history. It seems to me that for Deakin, these paintings were his effort to remind his fellow Californians to appreciate their past. And that, I believe, he succeeded. It's up to us to decide what to do with that past as we look to our future. So thank you very much for coming today and for your interest in these wonderful artifacts of California history. Do you want me to do questions? Yeah. I'm happy to answer or try to answer questions. Oh, goodness, Ben.
I have a question. So you said that the paint donated 11 first and the next 10 afterwards. Why was there the delay?
I don't know. I don't know. That's just the proof we have, the letters from the Willoughbys. You know, was like, here are the first 11, and then a year later. And the friars actually gave the Willoughbys Shumash baskets that they had as a thank you. And there's a lovely note from Mrs. Willoughby saying, it's in my sewing room, thank you so much, I'm using it in my sewing room, the basket. So things you learn when you go through these letters. But yeah, I'm sorry, can't answer that one. Yes?
What was that decree of secularization? What prompted that?
So the decree of secularization is basically a decree saying we don't need these church institutions. So the Mexican government was very anti-church. The church is seen as the mainstay of the colonial society, and the new independent Mexican government is trying to do with all those colonial institutions. And this is the 19th century, you know, you're starting to get new ideas about what government should be. Mexico wouldn't have a stable government for much of the 19th century, but that was the feeling, is we need to be independent, we're our own people, and so the church, we don't want church-run institutions. And so you didn't need missions then, because, you know, it's done its job, basically. So under the Spanish government, indigenous people are subjects of the monarchy, and they are considered human, so they're not supposed to be enslaved. And in the Mexican government, they're considered citizens, because the monarchy's gone, you're now citizens. And so any protections they had under the colonial government, albeit it was a very paternalistic policy, but in the Mexican government, all those protections for Indians or indigenous people were done away with, but they were now considered citizens. And then under the US government, they're considered an environmental hazard, and that's when you get policy to eradicate genocide. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good question. I do know he painted other things. I do know that he did do some commissions of individual missions. You know, Frank Goss gave me some insight into that as well, way back when. So he did do individual commissions. So you see individual paintings. It wasn't, I think he was really concerned about hanging on to this series. So the Phyla Rogers, for instance, donated some working drawings to the archive library reflecting some of the work he did here. He traveled to these missions, but in many ways, the paintings are often there's a lot of artistic license. And in some cases, he's painting more there than there actually was at that time. The landscape is very different. Like, I love Mission San Ynez. I think it's right behind Dacia. It looks like you're in the Alps, instead of Solvang, right? So in that, it's like any historical document. You got to understand who created it and who their audience is meant to be, because that's going to help influence how you interpret the document. But in some cases, there really wasn't much left on some of these. You do see Soledad is in really poor shape, but some of these, like we have photographs of Mission San Antonio in the late 19th century, and he's painting it looking much better than it was looking in those photographs. So, it's a good question. Any other? Yes.
Did I understand you to say that somebody else owns the land of the mission?
Yes.
Yeah. So the mission lands were huge. Huge. Like, I can't even tell you how many hectares it was. I mean, far and wide, because they were supposed to be self-sustaining. So it was all held in trust in the colonial system, the Spanish colonial system, for indigenous people, because the missions were supposed to be temporary, teaching skills, language, converting, so that they would be integrated into Spanish colonial society, and then you would return the land and everybody would, become part of the colonial society. But when the Mexican government needs money, it sells everything. And so it's not until actually Abraham Lincoln that the mission buildings themselves are returned to the Catholic Church. I could go on forever. The difference being Mission in Santa Barbara, the friars always stayed there. Now what that sets up is a very interesting fight, jurisdictional fight in the late 19th century, because the diocese, the bishop is saying, well, that means it belongs to us now. And the friars are like, no. It's our home, we built it, and we've always been here, and we're still here. So it's kind of an interesting little thing. And of course, the friars won. Yeah. Pardon?
But they don't own it.
No, we do own the land. We have about 15 acres. But we don't own all the land we used to own, if that makes sense. It used to be like out to DP, Dos Pueblos, I should say, everywhere, okay? Because these were huge agricultural enterprises, huge herds of cattle, of sheep. There's, all sorts of things going on, all sorts of industries. It's huge. I often have school children say, how many acres did the mission own? I have no idea. Like, as far as your eye can see, and then even farther. Yeah. And they didn't really own it. They held it in trust. Yeah. Other questions? I just want to point out that the Historical Museum does have a book with the watercolors in them. Out there on the internet, you can find other publications from previous years. This is one the Crocker Museum did. This is the one I showed you the cover of that the Natural History Museum did. This is one version of a publication the Archive Library did. This is the hardcover version, and it's kind of like this room. It's the only place you get both the watercolor and the oil side by side. I do have to warn you, the oil is before they got cleaned. Okay, this was published in 2009. And they got cleaned in between 2014 and 2016. This was before the Historical Museum owned the watercolors, I should say. I would also encourage you, as you look around, to find out which ones are not twins. Most of the paintings are similar in oil and watercolor, but a few are not. So it's kind of a little treasure hunt. Okay, and any others? I'm happy to talk afterwards, too. Thank you.
Thank Thank you so much, Monica. I love this collection. It's such an incredible example of the power of art to truly make change. So thank you guys so much for taking this deep dive with Monica and the museum here tonight. And again, thanks to our friends at the Old Mission and the Mission Archive Library. As Monica mentioned, the museum acquired these watercolors behind me and at the other end about a decade ago. And we did that thanks to the generosity of several donors in our community and a pretty large concession from the sellers through Sullivan Goss. So I want to again thank them tonight, as how our museum collection is built is with the generosity of people like you. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Monica, and please continue to enjoy. There's more wine. You can visit our exhibitions. This will stay open for a little while until March 11th. And behind the screen over here is our evening wear exhibition. It's called Seasonal Soirees. So please enjoy, and thank you so much for coming.